Gary Smith leaned back in the creaking chair on the porch of the cabin, gazing out at the darkening woods. The air was still, thick with the scent of pine and the faint aroma of dust carried on the summer breeze. Arizona was a different world from Mississippi, where he'd grown up surrounded by flatlands and slow-moving rivers. Here, the jagged mountains loomed in the distance, and the air seemed sharper, almost electric. The cabin had been Eddie's idea, a rustic getaway for their group to celebrate finishing another grueling semester. Eddie had insisted the isolation would be good for the soul, though Gary suspected it was more about Eddie wanting to show off his survival skills. Tina and Paul had come along for the ride, and Gary, needing a break from the monotony of part-time gigs and endless heat back home, had reluctantly agreed. That evening, as they sat around the fire pit outside the cabin, a sudden chill seemed to sweep through the woods. Gary poked at the flames with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the air. The summer had brought no reprieve to the dry lands, but tonight, an unexpected snow flurry had begun to fall, light and ethereal. Snow in the Arizona summer. It was strange, but not unheard of, especially at higher elevations. Still, it made the woods feel otherworldly, as though they were trapped in a dream. "You ever hear about the creatures out here?" Eddie asked, leaning forward with a conspiratorial grin. "Like the weird stuff. Skinwalkers? Shadow people? That kind of thing?" Gary chuckled nervously, remembering a magazine he'd read at a gas station on the way up. The article had been sensationalist, but it detailed sightings of strange, unidentified creatures across the Southwest. He hadn't taken it seriously, chalking it up to tall tales, but now, in the flickering firelight, the stories crept back into his mind. "I don't believe in any of that," Tina said firmly, though her eyes darted to the dark line of trees. "It's just folklore." "Folklore usually comes from somewhere," Eddie countered, his grin widening. "You just wait. Something's gonna happen tonight." Paul rolled his eyes, pulling his hoodie tighter against the chill. "Yeah, like you snoring loud enough to scare the wildlife." The banter eased the tension, and they sat there for a while longer, laughing and sharing stories. But as the fire began to die down, Gary felt a prickle of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. When they finally retired to the cabin, Gary couldn't sleep. The wind howled faintly outside, and the snow continued to fall, creating a thin, pale blanket on the forest floor. Unable to rest, he got up and peered out the window. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and foreboding in the moonlight. And then he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized there was something behind one of the trees, barely visible. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were wrong, too tall, too lean. Its pale, featureless face stared directly at the cabin, unblinking. Gary's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back from the window, covered, heart-pounding. "Guys," he hissed, waking Eddie and Paul. There's something out there." Eddie groaned, half asleep. "Probably just a deer or something." "No," Gary insisted. "It's not a deer." Reluctantly, Eddie got up, grabbing a flashlight. He and Paul followed Gary to the window, but the figure was gone. "See?" Eddie said with a yawn. "Nothing." But Gary wasn't convinced. He didn't sleep at all, and by morning his unease had spread to the others. Tina, who had been skeptical the night before, now seemed jittery, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to hike a nearby trail, the creature revealed itself again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It moved with unnatural grace, darting from tree to tree just out of sight. The group froze, their laughter and conversation cut short. "What the hell is that?" Tina whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the creature lunged. It was fast, faster than anything they'd ever seen. Paul was the closest, and it took him down in an instant. His scream echoed through the forest, chilling Gary to his core. Eddie swung his hatchet wildly, but the creature evaded him with almost mocking ease. "Run!" Gary shouted, grabbing Tina's arm. They sprinted back toward the cabin, Eddie close behind. Paul's screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Inside the cabin, they barricaded the door with furniture, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Tina was sobbing, and Eddie's hands shook as he clutched his hatchet. Gary stared at the bloodstains on the floor, unable to process what had just happened. They spent the night huddled together, weapons in hand. The creature didn't try to break in, but they could hear it outside, its heavy footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, Gary thought he heard it whispering, an unintelligible sound that made his skin crawl. When dawn finally broke, they knew they had to leave. Gathering what little courage they had left, they made a run for the car. The snow had stopped, but the forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The creature followed them, always just out of reach. They could feel its presence, a weight in the air. When they finally reached the car, Eddie fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. They didn't call the police. What could they say? That something unexplainable had killed their friend? It felt too surreal, too nightmarish to share. As they drove away, Gary stared out the window, the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on him. He thought of his family back in Mississippi, how his mother used to warn him about going too far into the woods. "The forest doesn't always welcome visitors," she'd say. For the first time, Gary understood what she meant. Michael Stallone trudged along the dirt trail winding through the dense Montana woods, sweat glistening on his brow despite the coolness of the shaded forest. The stillness was punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of distant birds. Montana was a far cry from the crowded streets and sun-drenched beaches of Miami, but that was precisely why Michael had come. A break from the relentless heat and noise of the city felt like a gift, even if the quiet sometimes pressed in too close. The hike had started as a simple escape, just a day's walk to clear his mind and soak in the beauty of the wilderness. Michael had always liked the idea of solitude, but now, alone among the towering pines and snow-dappled peaks, he found himself missing the buzz of human life. The weather had taken an odd turn too, snow in summer. It fell lightly through the treetops, catching the sunlight like tiny crystals. At first, Michael thought it was ash from a distant fire, but no, it was definitely snow. He paused at a clearing, resting against a large rock as he drank from his water bottle. The silence here was deeper, almost suffocating. He'd read about Montana's vast wilderness, how it was home to creatures that rarely showed themselves. Michael wasn't superstitious, but he'd heard whispers of strange stories, legends passed down by locals. One name stuck out from his online rabbit hole, Rugaru. The name carried a certain weight, a sense of unease that he had laughed off when he'd read it. But now, standing alone in the quiet forest, Michael couldn't help but wonder. A snap of a branch brought him sharply back to the present. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. About 20 yards away, partially obscured by a cluster of trees, something moved. It was too large to be a deer, and the shape was all wrong. He strained to see through the shifting shadows. Then he heard it, a low growl, guttural and resonant, followed by a chilling, almost human-like screech that echoed through the woods. Michael froze, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the earth. The thing stepped closer, still hidden in the trees. From what little he could see, it stood upright, its hulking frame covered in patches of matted fur. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, a yellowish hue that seemed to pierce right through him. Michael's breath hitched as it let out another growl, this one deep enough to vibrate the ground beneath him. He bolted. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he sprinted back down the trail. The undergrowth tore at his legs and branches whipped at his face, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, he could hear the heavy crunch of something pursuing him, its strides unnaturally long and deliberate. The trail twisted and turned, and Michael's mind raced alongside his pounding heart. He thought of his family back in Miami, his sister always teasing him for being a wannabe adventurer, his mom's constant reminders to be careful. "Nature's beautiful, but it doesn't play fair," she'd say. Those words felt painfully true now. Night fell quickly, and with it came a biting chill. Michael knew he couldn't keep running indefinitely. His legs ached, and his breath burned in his chest. He found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and decided to stop. He gathered what little dry wood he could find and started a fire, the small flames offering a fragile sense of security. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The creature didn't make an appearance, but Michael could feel it out there, circling, watching. The wind carried faint noises, branches snapping, low grunts, the shuffle of heavy feet. He tried to distract himself, staring into the flames and letting his mind drift to happier times. His dad, long gone now, had taught him how to light a fire during their camping trips. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of simpler days. A sudden slam against a nearby tree snapped him out of his thoughts. The force shook the ground, and Michael's fire sputtered as if recoiling from the impact. His heart raced anew as he grabbed a burning stick, holding it like a weapon. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed alive, shifting and closing in. The creature didn't charge, but it didn't retreat either. It stayed just out of reach, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. Michael didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He sat by the dwindling fire, gripping the stick and praying for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, Michael knew he had to move. He gathered his things quickly, his every sense on high alert. The trail back to the main road was long, and he doubted he could outrun the creature if it decided to attack again. As he pushed forward, he heard it trailing him, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. The noises grew louder, the footsteps heavier. Michael stumbled, but forced himself to keep going, the promise of the road and potential safety pulling him forward. Finally, he saw it, a sliver of asphalt through the trees. Relief surged through him as he broke into a run. He didn't look back, not even when the growl came again, this time closer than ever. He burst onto the road just as a pickup truck rounded the bend. Waving frantically, Michael flagged it down. The driver, an older man with a skeptical look, hesitated before letting him in. Michael didn't explain much, just muttered something about a bear and begged to be taken to the nearest town. The truck sped away. Michael allowed himself to breathe. His body ached, his mind reeled, but he was alive. The driver tried to make small talk, but Michael's thoughts were elsewhere. On the creature, on the forest, on the stories he'd foolishly dismissed. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain. The wilderness didn't play fair. Dean Evans tightened his parka against the sharp chill of the New York winter as he trudged through the snow-laden trail. The Adirondacks were as beautiful as he'd imagined, the trees frosted with powder and the mountains towering in the distance like silent sentinels. Snow had been falling lightly all morning, its delicate touch a stark contrast to the bitter cold. Dean, who grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, wasn't used to this kind of relentless frost. The flat plains of home were prone to icy winds, but the chill there never seemed to carry the same bite as the deep woods in winter. He'd come here for solitude, a few days of camping and hiking to clear his mind. A messy breakup and the monotony of work had pushed him to seek escape. It had been years since his last trip like this, but the old camping gear still worked fine. He liked the thought of braving the wilderness alone, just him and nature. On his second day, he reached a clearing nestled between towering pines. He set up camp quickly, brushing snow off the ground to make space for his tent. As the evening came, he started a fire, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. He sat close, eating a simple meal and letting the flames melt away the day's tension. Dean thought of his family as he stared into the fire, their voices surfacing from the past. His mom's laugh, his dad's steady voice. His brother Mark, always teasing him about his love for these wilderness retreats. Mark had once joked that Dean would end up in a tabloid headline, "Man found in woods, eaten by bear." The memory made him smile. The quiet of the night settled in, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire or the distant howl of the wind. Then suddenly there was another sound, a faint crunch of snow. Dean froze, his hand tightening around his mug of coffee. It was faint, deliberate, and too heavy to be a deer. He scanned the shadows beyond the firelight but saw nothing. Then he heard it again. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight, clicking it on and shining it toward the trees. At first, the beam revealed nothing but snow-covered trunks and darkness. But then his light caught something, a shadowy figure, half hidden behind a massive tree trunk. It stood tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and a thick, fur-covered frame. Dean's breath hitched. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. He couldn't make out its face, but he could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking. The fire crackled behind him, its warmth suddenly feeling much too small, much too fragile. He had read about Bigfoot before, stories and supposed sightings in magazines, most of which he dismissed as hoaxes or exaggerations. But now, with this massive figure standing just yards away, those stories came flooding back. His pulse pounded in his ears. The creature didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just stared. After what felt like an eternity, Dean broke the spell. Slowly he backed toward his tent, keeping his flashlight trained on the figure. As he retreated, it stepped behind the tree, vanishing into the shadows. Dean didn't sleep that night. He doused the fire, packed his essentials, and waited in silence inside his tent. He could hear faint movements outside, the crunch of snow, the occasional snap of a branch. It was circling, keeping just out of sight. When the first light of dawn broke, Dean knew he couldn't stay. He needed to get out. He stuffed what he could into his backpack, leaving behind anything that would slow him down. He moved quietly, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. The forest seemed alive with tension. Every rustle, every sound felt amplified. Dean's breath was visible in the cold air as he moved, each exhale a cloud of panic. He knew the creature was still there. He could feel it. His phone had no signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. Instead, he texted his friend Mark, hoping the message might send later. "Something's following me. Heading back to the trailhead. If you don't hear from me, call for help." Hours passed as Dean made his way through the woods. He stuck to the trail when he could, but more often he veered off, trying to confuse whatever was stalking him. Twice, he glimpsed it, just a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, a hulking shape slipping between the trees. Once, it came close. He crouched behind a fallen log, holding his breath as the creature moved nearby. He could hear its heavy breathing, the crunch of its footsteps. It stayed there for what felt like forever before moving on. Dean didn't move until he was sure it was gone. The sun was high in the sky when he finally saw the dirt road that led to the parking area. Relief surged through him, but he didn't let his guard down. He kept moving, kept scanning the woods until he reached the edge of the trees. His car was in sight, dusted with snow. He ran the last stretch, fumbling with his keys as he unlocked the door and threw himself inside. Turning the ignition, he half expected the car not to start, but the engine roared to life. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw it again, a dark figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching him go. When he reached the nearest town, he pulled into a gas station and sat in his car for a long time, hands trembling on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed. The message to Mark had finally sent, and there was a reply. "What are you talking about? Are you okay?" Dean didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain it, didn't even know if he believed it himself. But one thing was certain, the wilderness had eyes, and he wasn't going back anytime soon.